Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to show you some examples on an extremely powerful tactical tool, which is called the discovery, or in some other books, you may read about discover check or discovered attack. They all relate to the same idea that I'll explain as soon as we look at the first position. And here is that. In this position, it looks like a normal situation, each side having a queen, white has a rook and bishop, while black has two rooks. So that's a bit plus on the black side. And if you do the pawn count, you'll see that white is one pawn up. So the balance of that is white has an extra bishop and pawn versus black's rook. And as we know, that gives black 1 point on the material balance scale. However, it's extremely important to be aware of the changes in the position. In this position, it is white's move, and when I finish explaining the situation, I'll get back to this starting position and tell you what would be if it would be black's turn. Now, a discovery always includes 3 participants, and all 3 of them always are on the same file rank or diagonal. One side, the attacking side, would have a strong piece, either a queen, rook, or bishop, and then another piece in between. While the other side, the defending side in this case, would have a major piece, typically a king or a queen, or sometimes even a rook or bishop or knight. In this case, we'll see an excellent example of what discovery is all about. The critical participants here are white's bishop, which is the piece behind the in-between piece, the white pawn on c4, and then on the other side there is, on the same diagonal, the black king on g8. What's special about this situation is that while white is not moving the bishop that's on b3, but moves a harmless looking pawn forward to c5, attacking black's queen, at the same time that white has attacked the black queen, it also opened up this diagonal and attacks the black king, and that's called a discovery. The problem now for black is that the black is in check, and black needs to react to that. And that means that black has no choice but lose his queen. Now, let's look at this position one more time. And imagine that it's not white's turn, but it is black's. What should black do about this threat? Because indeed the threat is to advance white's pawn from c4 to c5. Our opponent's upcoming threatening move is our threat. Now, if you are aware that that is what white would like to do, and you're on the black side of the board, you want to defend against it. Let's talk about some of the options that the defensive side may have. One way to deal with this situation is to move the king away from the diagonal. And if the king is gone from g8, where it is right now, then if white still pushes that pawn from c4 ahead, then the black queen or even pawn could safely simply capture the pawn on c5. Another less attractive alternative would be to move the queen away. Not a bad choice either, but would still allow the white pawn to advance with a check and then advance further. There is no reason for black to allow the advancement of white's c pawn at all. Or if it advances, you want to be able to capture it. So therefore, Typically, in such situations, when you are under a threat of a discovery coming, you'd want to move that third piece, oftentimes a king, out of the diagonal. So the best move in this position is moving the king to h8. Let's move on to our next example. What's special about this position is that white is actually in a check. And of course, that's the first thing to notice. What does your opponent want to do? And in tournaments, there is no rule that your opponent would need to announce that it is a check. You're the one that have to notice it yourself. In some situation, it can really cost you the game if you do not notice that. For example, would you have a queen on the board, for example, on f1 in this position? Imagine a queen on f1. And you forgot that you're in check and you touch your queen. That's on the highlighted square right now, f1. You move your queen yourself, trying, let's say, to move up to f7, the imaginary queen. Once you touched your queen, it would mean that you have to move your queen. And you cannot move your intended move, queen to f7, because you're in a check. So what would that mean? It would mean that your imaginary queen would have to move into a square that stops the check, and that is on f5. And as you can tell, the f5 square is well guarded by black, by the pawn and the rook, and that would mean you would lose your queen. So, as I said, first thing is always be aware, what does your opponent want to do? And the check obviously is a very serious threat. There needs to be a reaction to that. Now, generally speaking, when you're in a check, it means you need to defend. However, there are situations like this one when you're able to combine your defense with offense right away. And if here white finds the correct move, which at the same time will attack black's rook, white will actually come out ahead. Now, the white king is able to move to two different squares where it would attack black's rook. If the king moves to f4 right now, it truly attacks the rook. The problem is, that's all it does. It moves out of the check and attacks the rook. And the black rook has an option to simply move away and be safe. And as you can see, black right now has the material advantage, being up an exchange. Being up a rook versus a bishop, which is up 2 points. Compare this with the correct move, with the white king moving to f6. You may wonder what's the difference. The king moved out of the check, attacked the rook, and the rook moves away, and black maintains his material advantage. How is it different? Well, the big difference is that by moving away from the same diagonal where white's bishop was and the black king, all of a sudden it created a discovery, a discovered check. Now that the black king is under attack, black needs to respond to that, and then after the king moves, black simply loses the rook on g5 and eventually the game. Now white is up a full bishop. Let's move on to our next example. In this endgame, black was very optimistic, just created a good-looking pin by moving the rook to a2, attacking white's bishop on e2. The bishop absolutely cannot move because the white king cannot be remaining in attack. So what should white do? Should white move the rook to e3 and protect the bishop? Well, it's certainly an option, but not a great one, because then black happily would exchange 4 important pieces, and then grab the pawn on c3 and have an extra pawn in a pawn endgame, which typically guarantees a simple win. However, in our starting position, white does not necessarily need to think on defense. And again, it's important to recognize the pattern of discovery. So my request to you is try to pause the video for a moment and try to recognize where is there a potential for discovery. Which are the three pieces, two white and one black, that will be the participants of this discovery. And at the end of the day, it will result in material gain for white. Again, the hero is the white rook on h3. The suffering side is the king on b3. And you know the rest. The little pawn in between becomes the star. c4. All of a sudden, it's a discovered check from the white rook to the black king. And at the same time, the white pawn attacks an important piece, the black bishop on b5. Black needs to move his king, and then pawn takes bishop on b5 gives white a clear big advantage. Let's see the next example. Here we go. This is a tricky situation. If you look at the position, you'll see that there is a complete material balance, even though white has a bishop versus black's knight, but as we know, those two are of equal value, 3 points each. Hopefully, by now, after seeing the first three examples, you will recognize which three are the key pieces in this position. One, of course, is the bishop, the rook, which is in between, and the black king on b8. They are the key participants. That means that if white moves away his rook anywhere, black will be in a discovered check. Now, typically, we want to optimize the material gain that we can accomplish using this special circumstance. The first thing that you may think of, hey, can't we just capture that knight on c6? Since black does not have the time to capture our rook with the pawn on b7, because this is a discovered check. The king moves out and then our rook is free. Well, it's an interesting thought. However, you always need to be aware also of your opponent's plans. And in this case, that is capturing our bishop. And all white will win here is a pawn on c5. Which is not bad. Winning a pawn is much better than not winning anything. However, if you can win a much more valuable piece, you certainly should be looking out for that. As the famous saying goes, when you see a good move, look for a better one. So in this case, the key problem was that the white bishop was under attack. However, if white finds the correct move, white at the same time can save his own bishop and attack another very valuable piece. Remember this important pattern. And the correct move is rook to g7. After rook g7, what happens is the white bishop no longer is under attack. However, it still checks black's king, and when it moves out, white succeeds in capturing black's most valuable piece left on the board. A very important pattern. Let's move on. Here we go. In this situation, we have a complete material balance, each side having a rook, a bishop, and 4 pawns. In this case, the important factor is that black's bishop on g4 is on an unprotected square. And again, we can see the three participants, in addition to black's bishop, the white rook, and the white bishop. Now this only becomes important if the bishop, the in-between piece, is able to move away to attack another important piece. And here, that is the case indeed. The white bishop is able to move to a safe square from where it checks black king. The black king needs to move, and then voila, rook takes bishop on the following move, and white gained the bishop. A perfect example why generally try not to keep your pieces on unprotected squares, and especially not on the same line or file of your opponent's rook. Let's move on. Here we go. Now this is another very typical situation when one uses a combination, a sacrifice, to have material gain. Again, there are three participants. Try to recognize which are the three key pieces in the position. Two white ones and one black. Yes, hopefully you were right. It's the queen, the piece in between, and last but not least, the black queen. Now, here the story is that if white would try to move the rook someplace, it would certainly not be a good idea because black would just capture the white queen. Even if the rook would move to a7, all white would offer is the exchange of queens and still not accomplish much, not gain anything. However, instead, if the rook is able to move away where it would at the same time attack black's king, that would be a whole other story and would guarantee white material gain. Again, try to pause the video and figure out what white's move should be. And the answer to that is rook takes bishop. Check. Whether the king moves out of the way or captures, which he rather should do, then black's queen was unprotected and therefore the material gain is very obvious. Again, it's very important to point out that the black queen again is on an unprotected square. If it would be protected by black's knight or another piece, this whole combination would not work. Let's move on to our next example, which is a very short game. It's a very typical opening trap. Here is how the game starts with the French defense. d4, d5, and e5. This is called the advanced variation of the French. c5, c3, knight c6. In this opening, the key battleground is the d4 pawn. White is hoping to keep a pawn there at all times, while black is hoping to invite, provoke, force white to trade on c5 and then to have a bishop there. Knight f3 and queen b6. This is the few exceptions when bringing the queen out early in the game is acceptable because the position is rather closed and therefore time is less important than in open positions when the files against the king are or can be easily opened. White continues developing, and this is a key moment where black right now should be playing bishop d7 or a trade of pawns on d4 first and then bishop d7. But in our sample game, black captured on d4, white captured back, and black made the big mistake, the blunder of capturing this pawn, being too greedy. Now, after knight takes knight, black will have to recognize the loss of material. And it would be a further mistake, making things even a whole lot worse, if the queen now captures the knight. Because again, the black queen is on an unprotected square, allowing white a discovery, playing bishop to b5, and then it's a check. And when black responds to that, the black queen is falling. Of course, after bishop d7, it's even better to first exchange the bishops than capturing black's queen and giving up your own bishop. Hence, this is another check. Black does not have the time to run away with his queen anyway. A very important opening trap I hope you'll never fall into. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this scenario, it is black's turn, not white. By now, I bet you can recognize that the key actors are the bishop, the knight, and the white queen. They are all on the same diagonal, and black has a powerful knight move. In fact, it seems that they have two of them, and that's the tricky part, to make sure you don't give the wrong one. Moving the knight away with a check and opening the diagonal to attack white's queen looks like a good thing. Here, the catch is that the white queen would be able to move away and capture the knight, the check-giving knight, at the same time. And therefore, that would be a blunder. On the other hand, if the knight moves to b4, doing the same, but not quite the same, checking the white king, opening the diagonal. However, in this case, the white queen cannot capture the knight. White needs to either move the king or capture the knight with the pawn, and in either case, white loses the queen. Let's move on. This is one of the few examples in this lesson when the discovery does not involve a check. And I wanted to illustrate that it does not necessarily always include a check. In this case, again, our heroes are all lined up on the same file, and the black king is able to move out of the way, open up the e-file, and attack the rook at the same time. It's kind of like a fork, but in a much more hidden, trickier way. White cannot avoid the loss of material. Let's move on. This is another extremely common scenario right out of the opening, that one file is open and one side or the other would occupy that file with a rook, and in the meantime there is a piece in between, namely the bishop, and the black queen never went anywhere yet, is still in its initial square. In such situations, it's very powerful to give up the bishop for just the pawn and then capture the opponent's queen by only giving up a rook. Now, if you look into what was given up and what you captured, you'll learn that you gave up a bishop, that's worth 3 points, as well as a rook, that's 5, so 3 plus 5, 8, versus gaining the opponent's queen and pawn, that's 9 plus 1. So white gained 2 points. A very significant gain. Here is the next example, where again it is black's turn. By now we know the lined up pieces are rook knight versus the queen. Now this is another tricky one, because the first things you would look at if you have a check available with your knight, the in-between piece, and then rook takes queen on d1. Again, it's a tricky one, because if black, for example, captures on f3 with a check, at the same time that the white queen will move away from the d file, the queen will capture the knight and be completely safe. The same problem would arise if the knight would give the check on e2, that again the white queen would move out of the attack and capture the knight. So what is the correct move then? Well, it's not a check this time, but attacking the rook, moving to b5. When you learn that the king cannot be attacked or cannot be attacked successfully, you look at the next most valuable piece, and that was the white rook on a7. Now what happens is the white queen is under attack, it will need to move, and then knight will take rook, gaining material. And let's get to our very final example in this lesson, which is a rook endgame with even material. And the tactics are much less occurring in endgames, but nevertheless, be always ready for it, just like in this position. The white king that's in between the white rook and the king can move away very successfully by attacking black's rook. And it's not only attacking black's rook, but at the same time creates a discovered check. Black cannot avoid losing his rook. Well, I hope you learned from all these discovery examples. It's one of the most powerful tactics in chess. Be aware of them when your opponent wants to trick you, and use them to your own advantage and benefit to win games. Have fun and be back next week for some more chess goodies. Take care. Bye-bye.